On a winter morning, the sky above Ouagadougou roared with thunder. But it was not a storm. It was the unmistakable sound of Russian MiG-29 fighter jets cutting across the horizon, escorting a presidential aircraft usually reserved for the most powerful leaders in the world. On the tarmac, soldiers of Burkina Faso stood frozen, staring at the red carpet that had been rolled out on their own soil. Cameras flashed, disbelief spread, and then a young captain barely in his mid-30s walked forward with calm precision, President Ibrahim Traoré. Why would Moscow extend such honors to a man from a small, landlocked African nation? Why would international broadcasters like CNN break into their programming to question why a single visit carried such secrecy? For 48 hours, President Traoré disappeared from the public eye. No official agenda, no press conferences, only whispers, satellite images, and speculation. French officials demanded answers. American analysts raised alarms. What was happening inside those restricted Russian facilities? The truth, as it later emerged, was not what the world expected. This was not a mission for weapons. There were no tanks, no missiles, no military parades. Instead, there were blueprints, diagrams, and knowledge, the tools of survival in a land where water is scarce and electricity unreliable. What unfolded was not just a diplomatic trip, but a turning point that signaled something much deeper, the possibility that one of Africa's poorest nations could break free from the old chains of dependency. And so, my friends, the question remains, what did Ibrahim Traoré really bring back from Moscow? Gold, oil, weapons? Or something far more dangerous to the old order, the power to replicate survival without permission? Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happened over those 2 silent days has already shaken Paris, Washington, and Brussels, and it may change the destiny of Africa itself. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. The story began not with a press conference or a signed treaty, but with silence. For 48 hours, President Ibrahim Traoré vanished from the public stage. No statements, no photos, no official schedule. Only fragments of evidence hinted at what was unfolding. Commercial satellites tracked a convoy of unfamiliar vehicles traveling across snow-covered roads in Russia, deep into restricted zones usually closed to foreign guests. International broadcasters, caught off guard, interrupted their regular programs. CNN asked bluntly, why would the Kremlin extend such secrecy for a leader from Burkina Faso, a nation whose economy represents less than 1% of global trade? In Brussels, NATO analysts flagged the situation as symbolic, even unprecedented. Fighter jet escorts, the kind of honor reserved for superpower leaders, were suddenly granted to a young African officer who had risen from the barracks to the presidency. French officials, frustrated and unnerved, demanded answers. For decades, Burkina Faso had been considered peripheral, a country to be managed with aid packages and loans. And yet, in those 48 hours, it became the center of military briefings in Europe and policy debates in Washington. Then came the leaks. Grainy footage surfaced online, captured by an anonymous source. In one clip, Ibrahim Traoré appeared inside a Russian drone development hangar. He was not standing next to generals or inspecting missiles. He wore boots and gloves, speaking directly with engineers about battery storage, solar efficiency, and how drones could be adapted to desert conditions. Observers were stunned. This was not the posture of a buyer shopping for weapons. This was the posture of a student, a learner gathering knowledge. Radio hosts back in Ouagadougou repeated the same question: what did Traoré intend to bring home? Was he negotiating for gold, oil, or defense guarantees? Or was there something far more radical at play? The whispers grew louder. Reports suggested that he had declined traditional weapons packages and instead requested technical schematics, open-source blueprints for water harvesting, off-grid energy, and agricultural resilience. Inside American briefings, one analyst spoke with unusual bluntness. If they succeed in replicating these systems, the old tools of leverage, sanctions, loans, dependency become meaningless. That single line captured the essence of the crisis for Western policymakers. For half a century, Africa's development had been managed through external controls, IMF conditions, infrastructure loans from Paris, security guarantees from Washington. But what if a leader chose to bypass all of that, not by rejecting aid, but by making it irrelevant? Back in Burkina Faso, anticipation was building. State television remained silent, offering no explanations. But social media burned with speculation. Young people shared satellite images and snippets of leaked video captioned with bold declarations. He went for tools, not toys. Farmers in the countryside asked if new irrigation methods might be coming. Teachers in the cities wondered if new materials for schools would arrive. The nation was waiting not for promises, but for proof. The climax of this silence came at the airport in Ouagadougou. As the Russian presidential jet descended once more, escorted again by MiG fighters, the spectacle was electric. Cameras zoomed in on the staircase. But before Ibrahim Traoré appeared, another figure descended first, a man carrying a plain black briefcase. No insignia, no diplomatic crest. Security allowed it through without inspection. Within hours, rumors exploded. Some claimed it was filled with cash, others whispered of secret agreements. Yet in the weeks that followed, the truth surfaced piece by piece. Community schools in northern provinces began to receive strange packages. Cloth charts printed with step-by-step instructions for assembling solar water pumps from recycled copper. Blueprints for modular classrooms that could be built in days, designed to withstand dust storms. Manuals translated into French and Moray explaining how to wire low-voltage batteries into lamps. The briefcase, it turned out, was not a vault of weapons, but a library of survival. The official event remained cloaked in secrecy, but the pattern was clear. Traoré had not traveled to Moscow to negotiate for military might. He had gone to secure the tools of resilience, the kind of knowledge that could transform villages without waiting for aid convoys or international approval. This was the event that changed everything, a diplomatic journey framed in the language of power politics, but revealed in the substance of survival. And for both allies and adversaries, it was a signal that could not be ignored. The silence of those 48 hours was deafening. In diplomacy, silence is rarely neutral. It signals either collapse or transformation. And in this case, it became the drumbeat that carried across Africa and into the halls of power in Europe and America. What the world expected was a military pact. What emerged was something no less threatening to the old order, a blueprint for survival. The climax came with the image of the black briefcase. Grainy, shaky cell phone footage showed it being carried down the stairs of the Russian presidential jet before Traoré even appeared. No crest, no diplomatic seal, no fanfare. Just a plain case, uninspected, ushered into Burkina Faso as if its contents mattered more than any speech or parade. Within minutes, the images went viral. Speculation spread like wildfire. Was it cash? Was it a secret treaty? Was Moscow handing Traoré a classified weapons system? Weeks later, the truth surfaced in fragments, and it stunned even the skeptics. The briefcase was not filled with weapons or money. It was filled with knowledge. Inside were schematics for solar grids, manuals for low-cost water pumps, instructions for modular schools, and step-by-step diagrams for drones that could scan farmland instead of cities. In community schools, teachers unrolled cloth charts with diagrams printed in French and Moray explaining how to build irrigation units from scrap copper and tubing. Women's cooperatives distributed guides on repairing solar lamps. Young students with nothing but chalk and paper began practicing the logic of coding. For the people of Burkina Faso, the symbolism was electric. Their president had not returned with empty promises, nor with foreign contracts chained to debt. He had returned with a practical library of resilience. And the message was clear: survival could be engineered at home. Dignity could be built with one's own hands. The reactions abroad were swift, and they revealed the unease of a world unprepared for this inversion of power. In Paris, policymakers were furious. For decades, French-backed loans had defined the infrastructure landscape of West Africa. The formula was simple: dependence meant leverage. But what happens when a village can power its own lights and irrigate its own crops without waiting for approval from Paris? A senior French official was quoted privately admitting, "If this spreads, our influence shrinks faster than any political speech could achieve." Envoys scrambled to offer new cooperative research programs, but the truth was already clear: knowledge was flowing outside their control. In Brussels, NATO analysts shifted their focus. The MiG escort had been symbolic, but the real alarm was in the prototypes Traoré had seen. One confidential briefing concluded, decentralized systems are sanction-resistant. You cannot embargo a photocopy. What terrified them was not an army, but an idea. In Washington, the debate was sharper. Intelligence assessments confirmed no weapons had been transferred, but they warned of something more dangerous in the long-run precedent. If one African nation could bypass dependency by replicating survival technologies, others would surely follow. Some American strategists urged a hardline response, warning that U.S. influence could evaporate in the Sahel within a decade. Others, however, saw opportunity. If America embraced this shift, offering open-source support instead of aid loans, it might reclaim moral leadership in a region long tired of conditional assistance. Meanwhile, on the streets of West Africa, the reaction was visceral. Radio hosts in Mali replayed the footage of Traore in Russian labs, marveling that he asked about batteries, not bombs. Social media users in Niger captioned the airport video with, "He went for tools, not toys." In Chad, student groups began printing photocopies of the leaked diagrams, treating them as badges of pride. The symbolism cut deeper than any speech could. For young Africans weary of hearing lectures about democracy while living without electricity, Traore's silence spoke louder than words. The climax of this story then was not a declaration of war nor a grand alliance. It was the quiet revelation that a plain black briefcase carried more power than a convoy of tanks. For the first time in living memory, Burkina Faso was not begging for protection or loans. It was asking for the blueprints of independence. And once those blueprints were copied, no capital, Paris, Washington, or Brussels could contain them. This was the moment when the narrative flipped. Western powers expected to confront another security crisis. Instead, they faced something far more destabilizing to their control, the possibility that Africa could learn, replicate, and survive on its own terms. That realization shook boardrooms and ministries alike because it suggested that the greatest threat to the established order was not revolution, but replication. The briefcase had barely touched the ground in Ouagadougou before its contents began to ripple outward, not through television speeches or government decrees, but through the quiet arrival of diagrams, charts, and translated manuals in the hands of teachers, farmers, and women's cooperatives. The effect was immediate. In the northern provinces, schools that once relied on broken chalkboards began experimenting with modular classrooms. Built from lightweight frames designed to withstand dust storms, these structures could be assembled in 3 days. Teachers received cloth charts imprinted with coding logic, enabling them to introduce programming concepts without computers. In villages where textbooks were scarce, children now practiced algorithms on paper, a symbolic leap into the modern age. In the drought-stricken East, farmers tested improvised drones adapted from recycled batteries. These devices scanned fields for soil moisture, guiding planting and irrigation decisions. For a nation where over 60% of the population depends on subsistence farming, the arrival of even rudimentary technology carried life-or-death consequences. Farmers no longer waited for agronomists from the capital. They experimented with tools made in their own backyards. For women and girls, the impact was especially visible. In towns like Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso, community centers introduced workshops on solar lamp repair and water filtration. Mothers who once spent hours searching for firewood learned how to maintain low-voltage batteries. Teenage girls, often excluded from formal education, began wiring simple circuits under the guidance of returning volunteers. In a society where women had long been burdened with survival tasks, the new knowledge meant freedom time, reclaimed skills, gained dignity, restored. These civil shifts quickly created political consequences. Ministries accustomed to long procedures and budget approvals suddenly faced a population moving faster than the state. In one late-night cabinet meeting, officials debated whether to integrate the off-grid projects into national programs or let them remain community-driven. The dilemma was stark. If citizens were already solving problems, government risked appearing irrelevant. For a country with a history of coups and fragile institutions, this was a profound change. Stability was no longer tied to speeches or electoral promises, but to the delivery of tangible results. President Traoré understood this shift. Instead of boasting of reforms, he pointed to working prototypes: a water pump built for under $3, a classroom lit entirely by recycled solar panels, a mesh network connecting villages without telecom approval. These were not slogans. They were proof. And proof was harder to argue with than politics. Internationally, the symbolism did not go unnoticed. France, still holding financial control over much of West Africa through the CFA franc, saw Burkina Faso's trajectory as a direct challenge. Credit lines were quietly offered, but they were rejected. The United States, while cautious, began acknowledging that a new precedent was forming: modernization without alignment to either Western aid structures or Chinese investment. Regional neighbors Mali, Niger, Chad sent delegations not of politicians, but of teachers and electricians eager to replicate what they saw. Within Burkina Faso itself, political rallies began to sound different. Instead of fiery ideology, citizens asked practical questions. How many villages have electricity this month? How many farmers received irrigation units? The mood was firm, even skeptical, but deeply engaged. For the first time in decades, politics was not about waiting for aid, but about measuring results. The outcome was not rebellion, but replacement. A political system where legitimacy was no longer defined by who held power, but by what the people could build with their own hands. In the dust of Ouagadougou, dignity was no longer imported. It was engineered, replicated, and shared. For many Americans watching from afar, the story of Ibrahim Traoré felt strangely familiar. News anchors described a young African leader who had refused weapons and demanded blueprints instead. Older viewers recalled their own history, the post-war years of the GI Bill, when veterans returned home not with speeches, but with skills that built homes, universities, and entire communities. The parallel was hard to ignore, a nation rising not by begging, but by building. Policy experts in Washington debated furiously. Some argued that Burkina Faso's experiment was little more than a symbolic gesture destined to collapse under the weight of poverty and instability. Others warned that it was precisely this symbolism that made it dangerous to the established order. A Pentagon analyst put it plainly, if each village can power itself, water itself, and feed itself, what leverage remains for us? The recognition stung. For decades, American influence in Africa had rested on aid programs, loans, and military cooperation. Yet here was a leader undermining that model, not by confrontation, but by irrelevance. Still, a different current of thought emerged. At military colleges and policy think tanks, some analysts began to admire Traoré's approach. They saw discipline in his silent strategy, in his focus on survival, and echoes of America's own ethos of self-reliance. One report circulated in Washington suggested a pivot. Instead of competing with Russia or China for influence through money or bases, the U.S. could offer what Traoré himself demanded: open-source technical support, agricultural fellowships, and teacher exchanges. If we position ourselves as a coach, not a creditor, the report read, we align with the deepest instincts of our own history. Meanwhile, in Paris, alarm bells rang. French policymakers admitted privately that their traditional tools, loans, subsidies, contracts were losing their bite. Burkina Faso's quiet rejection of credit lines set a precedent others might follow. In Brussels, energy executives voiced concerns that decentralized solar and water systems, if scaled, could undercut European-backed infrastructure projects. In Beijing, strategists noted the novelty of Traoré's path, neither Western aid nor Chinese investment, but a third model that threatened to inspire others. Across Africa, the reception was different. News outlets in Mali, Niger, and Chad replayed the footage of Traoré walking through Russian labs. Student groups shared the briefcase story with captions like, "He carried knowledge, not debt." For younger generations, the symbolism was magnetic. This was not just geopolitics, it was proof that survival and dignity could be reclaimed. Globally, the realization began to take hold. The most disruptive shift was not a new alliance or weapon system. It was the spread of an idea that blueprints and skills could travel faster than aid, and that once learned, they could not be sanctioned away. A British analyst summarized the dilemma bluntly in a NATO briefing: we can counter weapons with weapons. But how do you counter a photocopy that teaches a village to light itself? For the United States, the question became ethical as much as strategic. Should Washington resist this transformation or embrace it as part of its own values? Should it cling to leverage or rediscover the strength of teaching over trading? Either way, the example of Ibrahim Traoré revealed a truth that could no longer be ignored. The future of Africa, and perhaps the future of influence itself, might be built not by armies, but by knowledge copied in chalk on a classroom wall. In the end, there were no fireworks, no military parades, no triumphant declarations. What remained was dust rising from unpaved roads and children running barefoot toward classrooms lit by solar lamps they had helped assemble. For a nation long dismissed as fragile, this image carried the weight of rebirth. Ibrahim Traoré did not need to wave banners or sign treaties. He simply stood before village elders and spoke with steady conviction, "We do not ask for permission to be free. We rise because our children must rise with us." The message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso is still poor, droughts persist, instability lingers, and institutions remain fragile. Yet something irreversible has begun. A generation once taught to wait for aid is now being taught to build. And in that shift lies a challenge to every global power that has treated Africa as a client to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. For Paris, it is a warning the old model of loans and dependency is losing its grip. For Washington, it is a mirror. Can America recognize in Traore's strategy the very values it once held dear: self-reliance, education, and dignity? For Brussels and Beijing, it is a dilemma. How do you compete with an idea that spreads freely, a photocopy passed from one classroom to another, impossible to embargo or erase, but most of all, it is a signal to Africa itself? The briefcase story proves that dignity can be engineered, not imported, that survival can be taught, not bought, and that the most dangerous revolution is not fought with weapons, but with knowledge that multiplies in the hands of ordinary people. Brothers and sisters, I ask you this: do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective, yet can we continue to trust him to carry this vision forward, or should another leader one day take up the mantle? These are not just political questions. They are questions about the future of Africa's soul. If this story has moved you, then share it. Share it so that others can see that Africa's rise is not a rumor, not a headline, but a living reality being built in villages and classrooms today. And if you believe that truth is more important than propaganda, that dignity is more powerful than dependency, then subscribe. Because this is not the end of the story, it is only the beginning. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines.